The rusted iron gates stood 12 feet tall, their ornate scrollwork twisted into shapes that seemed to shift in Margaret's peripheral vision. Vines had claimed the metal decades ago, weaving through the bars like arthritic fingers refusing to let go. Frank fumbled with the envelope containing the deed and a single brass key the city clerk had handed them with trembling fingers just 3 hours earlier. "You sure about this, Maggie?" Frank's voice carried the weight of 38 years of marriage and 2 tours in Vietnam that had taken his left leg and left him with nightmares that still woke them both. His calloused hands shook slightly, not from age, but from the medication withdrawal they couldn't afford to prevent. Margaret studied the mansion beyond the gates. The Blackwood Estate loomed against the storm clouds like something torn from a Gothic novel, its Victorian silhouette both magnificent and menacing. Boarded windows gave it the appearance of a sleeping giant, while its wraparound porch sagged under the weight of neglect. Paint peeled from its wooden siding in long strips that fluttered like dead skin in the wind. "Look at it, Frank." She gestured toward the structure that would either save or damn them. 12 acres, 32 rooms. The property taxes alone should be worth more than our entire pension. That's what worries me. Margaret understood his concern. She'd felt it too when the city clerk, a nervous young man named Timothy who kept adjusting his glasses, had explained the situation. The Blackwood family had vanished in 1987, leaving behind a mansion worth an estimated $3 million. No relatives had claimed it. No investors had bid on it. For 32 years it had sat empty while the city hemorrhaged money on maintenance and property management. The previous owners, Timothy had stammered, they just left. Middle of the night, car still in the garage, food still on the table. Police investigated, of course, but he'd shrugged helplessly. Sometimes people just want to disappear. Now, sitting in their Honda with its cracked dashboard and cigarette-burned seats, a car that might not survive another winter, Margaret felt the weight of their desperation. The foreclosure notice gave them 43 days. Frank's prescription costs had tripled when his insurance changed networks. Their savings account held exactly $247. She thought of their small ranch house in town, the one they'd bought in 1983 with dreams of hosting grandchildren they'd never had. The medical bills had started small. Frank's leg infection, her high blood pressure medication, the diabetes that crept up on them both like a thief in the night. Each month, the bills grew while their income shrank. Each month they chose between groceries and medications, heat and hope. "The city's been trying to sell this place for years," Margaret said, repeating what Timothy had told them. "They're losing $40,000 annually just keeping the utilities disconnected and the lawn maintained. $1 was their final offer. Take it or watch it get demolished for the tax write-off." Frank studied the deed again. Property this size, this close to Pittsburgh, there's got to be something wrong with it. Foundation issues, asbestos, lead paint. "Then we'll figure it out." Margaret's voice carried a steel that had sustained her through 4 decades of walking mail routes in Pennsylvania winters, through Frank's surgeries, through the slow erosion of everything they'd built together. "We're good with our hands. We've got time. And Frank," she reached across the seat to touch his weathered cheek, "what choice do we have?" The wind picked up, rattling the Honda's loose door panels and sending dead leaves dancing across the overgrown driveway beyond the gates. Margaret counted 7 chimneys rising from the mansion's various wings and turrets. Even if half the house was uninhabitable, it was more space than they'd ever dreamed of owning. Frank inserted the brass key into the gate's lock. It turned with surprising ease, as if the mechanism had been recently oiled. The gate swung open with barely a creak, revealing a cobblestone driveway that curved through untamed gardens toward the mansion's imposing entrance. Margaret eased the Honda forward, gravel crunching under their worn tires. As they approached the house, details emerged from the gloom. Stained glass windows on the upper floors caught what little light filtered through the clouds, casting rainbow fragments across the porch's peeling columns. A weather vane shaped like a raven perched atop the highest turret, spinning slowly despite the inconsistent wind. "Look at the size of it," Frank whispered. Margaret parked near the front steps and cut the engine. In the sudden silence, she could hear the mansion settling around them, creaks and sighs that sounded almost like breathing. The building seemed to lean forward slightly, as if studying these new arrivals with the same intensity they brought to examining it. She pulled the foreclosure notice from her purse, its red lettering stark against the white paper. 43 days to save everything they'd spent a lifetime building, or lose it all to creditors and medical bills that grew faster than Frank's pension could cover. The mansion waited, patient as a spider in its web. Margaret opened her car door and stepped into her new life. The cold November air hit Margaret's face like a slap, carrying the scent of rotting leaves and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded her of funeral flowers. She pulled her wool coat tighter as Frank struggled out of the passenger side, his prosthetic leg catching momentarily on the doorframe. After all these years, she still felt the urge to help him, and after all these years, she still knew better than to try. The mansion's front door stood 15 feet high, carved from what looked like mahogany darkened by decades of neglect. Margaret counted 6 windows on the first floor alone, each one boarded with plywood that bore the weathered stamps of the Millbrook City Planning Department. The porch wrapped around the entire structure, supported by columns that had once been white but now showed patches of bare wood like scabs on weathered skin. 32 rooms, Margaret murmured, pulling out her phone to take pictures for their insurance claim, assuming they could afford insurance. Frank, our entire house could fit in just the front section. Frank limped up the 3 stone steps, his breathing slightly labored. The medications he'd been forced to stop taking included a blood thinner and something for his circulation. Margaret had watched him grow paler over the past month, had seen him favor his good leg more heavily, but they both pretended not to notice. Pride was one of the few luxuries they could still afford. "Key should be here somewhere," Frank said, examining the door frame. The city clerk had mentioned a lockbox, though he'd seemed uncertain about the details. Timothy had stammered through most of their interaction, constantly checking his watch as if eager to conclude their business and forget it had ever happened. Margaret found herself thinking about their morning routine back home, their real home, the one they had 42 days left to save. Frank always woke first, padding to the kitchen to start the coffee while she organized their daily pill dispensers. 7 medications between them, color-coded by urgency. The blue ones were essential, the white ones they could skip if money was tight. They'd been skipping a lot of white ones lately. After pills came breakfast, toast if they had bread, oatmeal if they didn't, black coffee always. Frank would read yesterday's newspaper. They'd canceled their subscription, but Mrs. Kowalski next door saved hers for them, while Margaret planned her day around their limitations. Grocery shopping on Tuesdays when the senior discount applied. Frank's physical therapy appointments every other Thursday, the ones their insurance covered exactly 60% of, the small routines that had carried them through nearly 4 decades together. Found it. Frank's voice interrupted her thoughts. A small metal box hung beside the doorframe, secured with a combination lock. What was the number again? Margaret consulted the paperwork. 1887. The year the mansion was built, according to the deed. The same year someone had carved those numbers into the stone foundation, though the city records were unclear about who had originally commissioned the construction. The lock clicked open, revealing 2 keys, one modern brass key that matched the one for the front gate, and another that looked far older, made of black iron and shaped unlike any key Margaret had seen. Frank pocketed the strange one and inserted the brass key into the front door's lock. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Margaret said as Frank worked the lock. "Sunday dinners. Remember how we used to host them? Back when your pension covered everything and we thought we had time to save for retirement?" Frank nodded, his attention still focused on the stubborn lock. They'd hosted Frank's sister and her family every month for 15 years, until the medical bills started mounting and Margaret had stopped buying the extra groceries. She still missed the sound of conversation filling their small dining room, the way Frank would light up when his nephew asked about his military service. 6 bedrooms upstairs, Margaret continued, reading from the property description. "We could have people stay over, maybe contact some of those rental websites, make a little extra income." The lock finally gave way with a sound like grinding teeth. Frank pushed the heavy door open, and they were hit with a wave of stale air that carried decades of dust and abandonment. But underneath the expected mustiness, Margaret caught that same sweet scent from outside. Stronger now, almost overwhelming. "Jesus," Frank whispered. The foyer stretched before them like something from a museum, its ceiling disappearing into shadows 20 feet above their heads. A grand staircase curved along the far wall, its banister carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the dim light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows. Dust motes danced in the air like tiny spirits, and their footsteps echoed with a hollow quality that made the space feel impossibly large. Margaret pulled out her phone's flashlight, illuminating walls covered in faded wallpaper depicting pastoral scenes, shepherds and sheep, children playing in meadows, families gathered around abundant tables. The images felt like mockery now, reminders of security they'd never known and abundance they'd never achieved. Frank took a tentative step inside, his prosthetic leg clicking against the marble floor. "Maggie," he said quietly, "what have we gotten ourselves into?" Margaret was about to answer when the front door swung shut behind them with a soft, definitive click. They both turned, but the heavy mahogany had closed completely, sealing them inside the mansion's embrace. Frank reached for the handle, twisting it reflexively, but it held fast. "Must have auto-locked," he muttered, though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. He pulled out the brass key, fumbling to insert it from the inside, but the mechanism wouldn't budge. "Frank?" Margaret's flashlight beam wavered across the foyer. "Try the old key." The black iron key slid into the lock as if it had been crafted specifically for this door. With a smooth turn, the mechanism disengaged, and Frank pushed the door open again. Cool air rushed in, carrying the scent of approaching rain. "That's odd." Margaret studied the keys in Frank's palm. Why would a city-issued key not work from the inside? Before Frank could respond, a sound drifted from somewhere deeper in the mansion, a soft, rhythmic creaking like a rocking chair moving slowly back and forth. They both froze, listening. The sound continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. "Old house settling," Frank said, but he moved closer to Margaret. She nodded, though her practical postal worker's mind cataloged the inconsistency. Houses settled randomly, not in steady rhythms. Still, they'd committed to this gamble. 41 days now until foreclosure. She forced herself to step further into the foyer, her phone's light revealing more details of their new reality. A crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, its teardrops coated in decades of dust, but somehow still catching and fracturing the weak light into rainbow fragments across the walls. Margaret counted at least 60 bulbs in the fixture. Electricity bills would be astronomical if it worked, though given their financial situation, they'd likely be living by candlelight anyway. "Look at this craftsmanship," she said, running her fingers along the staircase's carved banister. The wood felt warm under her touch despite the mansion's chill. "Frank, these banisters would cost more than our mortgage payment. Hand-carved, probably 19th century. Frank limped toward an archway that led deeper into the house. "Kitchen should be through here, according to the floor plan." His voice echoed strangely in the vast space, seeming to linger longer than natural acoustics should allow. Margaret followed, her footsteps tapping against marble that had probably been imported from Italy when their great-grandparents were children. The archway opened into a hallway lined with doors, more rooms than they could possibly use, more space than they could possibly heat. "Maggie." Frank's voice came from ahead, tight with surprise. "You need to see this." She found him standing in the doorway of what was unmistakably the kitchen, though it looked like something from a historical preservation society. Cast-iron stoves dominated one wall, their surfaces blackened but somehow still gleaming. Copper pots hung from hooks along exposed beams, and a massive farmhouse sink stretched beneath windows that should have been boarded shut, but somehow allowed thin streams of natural light to filter through. But what had stopped Frank in his tracks wasn't the kitchen's Victorian grandeur, it was what sat on the central island. A wicker basket filled with fresh fruit, apples that still bore dewdrops on their red skin, bananas with barely a trace of brown, oranges that released citrus fragrance into the stale air. Beside the basket sat a loaf of bread, its crust golden and still slightly warm to the touch, when Margaret reached out hesitantly to test it. "This wasn't here when the city inspected last month," Frank said quietly. "Timothy mentioned they did a final walkthrough before putting it on the market." Margaret picked up one of the apples, turning it in her hands. Perfect. No bruises, no soft spots, no signs of the weeks or months it should have taken to arrange their purchase and transfer. The fruit looked like it had been picked that morning. Her practical mind offered explanations. A caretaker they hadn't been told about, perhaps, or neighbors with access who'd left a welcoming gift. But those explanations felt thin in the mansion's oppressive silence. She thought of their empty refrigerator at home, the way they'd started eating dinner earlier each day to make their groceries stretch further. "Frank," she said slowly, "what if someone's been living here?" The implications settled between them like dust. Squatters would explain the fresh food, but not the city's apparent ignorance of their presence. And if someone had claimed the mansion by occupation, where did that leave Margaret and Frank's legal ownership? The rocking sound drifted down from somewhere above them. Steady, rhythmic, deliberate. Not settling timbers, but something, or someone, moving with purpose through the rooms overhead. Margaret looked at her husband, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his weathered features. They could leave now, drive back to town, call Timothy and demand answers, retreat to their foreclosure notices and medication rationing and the slow, dignified surrender of everything they'd built together. Or they could stay, claim what was legally theirs, and confront whatever secrets the Blackwood Estate had been keeping for 32 years. The choice felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether the leap would bring salvation or destruction. Margaret's hand trembled as she set the apple back in the basket, its perfect surface somehow mocking in the kitchen's dim light. The rhythmic rocking overhead had stopped again, leaving behind a silence that felt expectant, waiting. "We should call Timothy," she whispered, though her voice still echoed in the cavernous space. "Ask him about caretakers, about who has keys." Frank nodded slowly, but made no move toward his phone. Instead, he sank heavily onto one of the high stools beside the kitchen island, his prosthetic leg extending stiffly. The past hour had taken more out of him than he'd admit. Margaret could see it in the way his shoulders sagged, in the pale cast of his skin under the weak light filtering through those impossibly unboarded windows. What if he doesn't know? Frank's question hung between them like smoke. What if the city just forgot? Bureaucrats lose paperwork all the time. You remember what happened with my disability claim? Took them 8 months to find forms they'd had the whole time. Margaret pulled her coat tighter around herself, though the kitchen wasn't actually cold. If anything, it felt warmer than the foyer, as if heat rose from the very bones of the house. "That's different, Frank. This is—" She gestured at the fresh bread, the perfect fruit. "Someone's been living here. Recently." The implications crashed over her in waves. Their legal ownership might be worthless if squatters had established residency rights. Worse, what if the previous occupants, the mysterious someone who'd left this food, didn't appreciate new owners showing up unannounced? Margaret had read enough news stories about vagrant camps, about desperate people defending territory they couldn't legally claim. "We don't know how many of them there are," she said, voicing the fear that made her stomach clench, "or what they might do to protect what they think is theirs." Frank's weathered hands gripped the edge of the island. "Maggie, look at this place. Really look at it." His voice carried 40 years of marriage, the tone he used when he was working through a problem step by step. "The doors aren't kicked in. The windows aren't broken. There's no garbage, no evidence of drug use, no smell of human habitation. If someone's squatting here, they're the most respectful squatters in history." Margaret wanted to agree, wanted to lean into his practical assessment, but her postal worker's instincts screamed warnings. In 4 decades of walking routes through every neighborhood in Millbrook, she'd learned to read the signs of occupancy, the subtle tells that separated empty houses from temporarily absent ones. This kitchen felt occupied in a way that defied rational explanation. "The Blackwood family," she said suddenly. Timothy said they just vanished. Middle of the night, car still in the garage. The implications of that detail struck her for the first time. "Frank, if their car was still here, how did they leave?" Frank's expression darkened. "Maybe they didn't." The words settled between them like stones dropped in still water, sending ripples of possibility neither wanted to explore. Margaret found herself cataloging the kitchen's shadows, wondering what 32 years of abandonment might have hidden in the mansion's countless rooms. She pulled out her phone, checking the signal strength. 1 bar, barely enough for a call. "We should go back to town, tonight, get a hotel room, call Timothy in the morning, do this properly." But even as she spoke, Margaret felt the weight of their bank balance like an anchor. Hotels cost money they didn't have. Timothy would ask questions they couldn't answer without sounding paranoid or foolish, and every day they delayed was another day closer to losing everything they'd spent a lifetime building. With what money? Frank's question echoed her thoughts. "Maggie, we've got 41 days and $247. We can't afford to be careful anymore." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. They'd moved past the luxury of caution weeks ago, when Frank's circulation medication jumped from $40 to $160. Past the comfort of prudent choices when Margaret started walking to the grocery store to save gas money. This mansion, whatever secrets it held, represented their last chance at financial survival. Frank reached across the island to touch her hand. "Remember what you used to tell me when I was having the nightmares? After I got back from overseas?" His thumb traced familiar patterns across her knuckles. "Sometimes the only way out is through." Margaret felt tears threatening. From frustration, from fear, from the devastating weight of choices that weren't really choices at all. Above them, something creaked again, slower now, as if whatever presence moved through the mansion's upper floors was listening to their conversation. "I'm scared, Frank." The admission escaped before she could stop it. Not just of this house, of what happens if we're wrong, if we can't make this work. Frank's grip tightened on her hand. "I know. But Maggie, I'm more scared of giving up, of letting them take everything we've worked for without a fight." The kitchen's silence pressed around them, heavy with possibility and threat. Outside, the first drops of evening rain began tapping against windows that shouldn't have been accessible, in a house that shouldn't have fresh food, owned by people who shouldn't have been able to afford it. Margaret looked at the basket of perfect fruit and made her choice. She reached for the apple again, this time lifting it with deliberate purpose rather than curiosity. The fruit felt solid in her palm, real and nourishing in a way their empty cupboards at home could never be. Margaret raised it to her lips and took a bite. The sweetness flooded her mouth, crisp, perfect, impossible. It tasted like autumn mornings from her childhood, like the orchard her grandmother had tended in rural Ohio before the bank took that too. She chewed slowly, swallowing not just the fruit but her reservations, her fear, her last vestige of rational retreat. "We're staying," she said, and the words seemed to echo through the mansion's bones. "Tonight, however long it takes." Frank's eyes widened, searching her face for signs of the careful, cautious woman who'd balanced their checkbook for 4 decades. "Maggie." "No." She set the apple down with finality that surprised them both. "We're done being careful, Frank. Careful got us foreclosure notices. Careful got us rationing medications and walking to save gas money." Her voice grew stronger with each word, fed by months of accumulated desperation. "This house is ours, legally, officially ours. Whatever's happening here, we're not running from it." The decision felt like stepping off a cliff's edge. But for the first time in months, Margaret felt something other than helpless anxiety. Purpose, direction, the fierce determination that had carried her through neighborhood dogs and ice storms during 37 years of postal routes. Frank studied her face in the dim light, and she saw the moment he recognized the shift in her, the same iron resolve that had gotten them through his recovery, through her mother's long illness, through every crisis that had tested their marriage. His shoulders straightened incrementally. "All right," he said quietly. "What do we need?" Margaret pulled out her phone, opening the Notes app with fingers that no longer trembled. "First, we inventory everything. Every room, every piece of furniture, every sign of recent occupation. We document it all. She glanced up at the ceiling where the mysterious sounds had originated. If someone else is living here, we need to know who, how many, and what they want. She paced to the kitchen window, peering through glass that shouldn't have been unboarded. The view revealed overgrown gardens stretching toward a stone wall that marked the property's boundaries, 12 acres of land that represented more wealth than they'd ever imagined owning, even in their modest dreams. Second, we make this place livable for us. The deed says the utilities were disconnected, but some of these lights work. She flipped a switch experimentally, gasping when warm yellow light flooded the kitchen from fixtures that should have been dead for decades. Electricity, heat, running water, we test everything. Frank shifted on his stool, his expression growing more animated as her plan took shape. The car is packed with enough clothes for a week. We've got your medications in the cooler. Third, Margaret continued, momentum building. We call Timothy tomorrow from here. Not from town, not from a hotel we can't afford, but from our property. We're not asking permission anymore, Frank. We're informing him of our residence. The kitchen seemed to pulse around them, as if the house itself was listening to their conversation and approving of what it heard. The rain against the windows had intensified, creating a rhythm that matched Margaret's heartbeat. She thought of their small apartment, with its stack of overdue bills, its empty refrigerator, its constant reminder of financial failure. Here, surrounded by marble and mahogany and mysterious abundance, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. What about, Frank gestured toward the ceiling, where the rocking sounds had originated. What about whoever left this food? Margaret's jaw set with determination that surprised her with its ferocity. Then we meet them, face to face, tonight if necessary. This is our house now, Frank, our home, our last chance. She picked up the apple again, taking another deliberate bite. Whatever arrangement they had with the previous owners, whatever understanding they had with the city, it ends now. The words felt like an incantation, a binding commitment that transformed them from visitors to residents, from cautious elderly couple to fierce protectors of their own survival. Margaret felt the weight of 41 days until foreclosure, but also the strength of 4 decades spent fighting for everything they'd built together. Frank slid off the stool, moving to stand beside her at the window. His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the automatic comfort of a lifetime's partnership. No going back? Margaret looked out at the vast grounds that now belonged to them, at gardens that could be restored and rooms that could shelter them through whatever years remained. She thought of Sunday dinners they could host again, of grandchildren they might finally have space to welcome, of dignity they could reclaim from the margins of poverty. No going back, she confirmed, sealing their fate with the certainty of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. Above them, the rocking began again, slower now, almost welcoming, as if the house itself was acknowledging its new residents. The rocking continued for exactly 13 heartbeats before stopping abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt different, charged with expectation rather than menace. Margaret squeezed Frank's hand, drawing strength from the familiar calluses earned through decades of honest work. First test, she said, releasing his fingers and moving toward the kitchen's far doorway. We explore, together, every room on this floor. Frank nodded, straightening as much as his prosthetic would allow, like those house inspections we used to do when we were looking to buy. Remember? You had that checklist. The memory almost made her smile. Younger versions of themselves walking through modest ranch homes, Margaret scribbling notes about foundation cracks and Frank testing faucets. They'd been so careful then, so methodical about a purchase that represented their entire life savings. Now they were exploring a mansion they'd bought sight unseen for $1, chasing mysteries instead of measuring square footage. They moved through the kitchen's opposite archway into what had clearly been a formal dining room. Margaret's breath caught at the massive table dominating the center, dark wood polished to a mirror finish, surrounded by 12 chairs upholstered in burgundy velvet that showed no signs of 3 decades abandonment. A sideboard stretched along one wall, its surface set with crystal decanters that caught the dying afternoon light like captured fire. Someone's been maintaining this, Frank said quietly, running his finger along the table's surface. "It came away clean. This isn't just preserved, it's being actively cared for." Margaret opened one of the sideboard's drawers, revealing perfectly organized silver flatware nestled in felt-lined compartments. Each piece gleamed as if recently polished. "Frank, look at this." She lifted a serving spoon, reading the engraved monogram. "B for Blackwood. This is the original family's silver." "Left everything behind," Frank murmured. "Timothy said they vanished overnight, but this—" He gestured at the immaculate room. "People don't abandon heirloom silver. Not unless something's very wrong." A new sound drifted from somewhere beyond the dining room. Soft footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. Margaret froze, her hand still gripping the silver spoon. The footsteps paused as if whoever was making them had heard the couple's conversation and was deciding how to respond. "Hello?" Margaret called, her voice carrying decades of authority earned from confronting unleashed dogs and hostile homeowners during her postal routes. "We're the new owners. We'd like to speak with you." The footsteps resumed, growing closer. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground beside the dining table, Frank positioning himself slightly behind her to compensate for his limited mobility. They'd faced uncertainties before: Frank's deployment, her father's stroke, the endless bureaucratic battles over his disability benefits. This was just another crisis requiring direct confrontation. A figure appeared in the doorway, elderly woman, perhaps 70, wearing a simple gray dress that looked freshly pressed. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her pale eyes held an expression of cautious assessment rather than surprise or alarm. "Mrs. Chen, I presume," the woman said, her voice carrying the refined accent of old Pennsylvania families. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell. I've been maintaining the property." Margaret felt Frank's surprise echo her own, but kept her expression neutral. "Maintaining it for whom?" "The city told us the house had been empty since 1987. Eleanor stepped fully into the dining room, moving with the careful grace of someone accustomed to navigating valuable antiques. "The city's records are often incomplete, I'm afraid. The Blackwood Estate has specific provisions for caretaking that predate modern bureaucratic oversight." "What kind of provisions?" Frank's question carried the skepticism of a man who'd spent years battling institutional inefficiency. Eleanor's smile was thin but not unfriendly. "The kind that ensure the house maintains itself, Mr. Chen. That it provides for those who truly need its sanctuary." Her pale eyes studied them both. "Though I confess, I wasn't expecting residents quite so determined." Margaret set the silver spoon back in its proper place, using the moment to process this development. A caretaker explained the fresh food, the perfect maintenance, even the mysterious sounds, Eleanor moving through rooms above them. But it raised new questions about their legal ownership, their rights as residents. "Are we the first?" Margaret asked. "The first buyers since the Blackwoods?" "The first to stay past sunset," Eleanor replied. "Previous potential residents found the arrangement unsuitable to their needs." The phrasing sent a chill through Margaret's chest. What arrangement? Eleanor moved to the sideboard, adjusting one of the crystal decanters with practiced precision. "The house provides, Mrs. Chen, shelter, sustenance, safety, but it requires certain considerations in return: understanding, acceptance." Her eyes met Margaret's directly. Discretion. Frank shifted beside her, his prosthetic creaking softly. "What happened to the Blackwoods?" "They became part of the house," Eleanor said simply. "As did I, in time, as you might if you prove suitable." The words hung in the air like an invitation and a warning combined, leaving Margaret to wonder if they found salvation or walked willingly into something far more complex than simple real estate ownership. Margaret's pulse hammered in her throat as Eleanor's words settled into the dining room's crystal-laden silence. "Became part of the house." The phrase carried implications that made her skin crawl, yet the practical part of her mind, the part that had balanced budgets through 4 decades of financial struggle, demanded clarification. "What exactly does that mean?" Margaret kept her voice steady, drawing on years of confronting difficult conversations with postal customers. "Becoming part of the house?" Eleanor's pale eyes seemed to catalog Margaret's expression, measuring her capacity for truth. "It means they found what they needed here, Mrs. Chen. Security, purpose, freedom from the uncertainties that plague those without resources." Her fingers traced the edge of the sideboard with practiced familiarity. In return, they offered their commitment to the estate's continuity. Frank shifted his weight, the slight creak of his prosthetic unnaturally loud in the charged atmosphere. "You're talking about some kind of contract. Legal obligations beyond the deed." Legal. Eleanor's laugh held no warmth. "Mr. Chen, what's legal when you're 67 and choosing between medication and groceries? What's legal when the bank threatens to seize everything you've spent a lifetime building?" Her gaze sharpened. "The arrangements here transcend conventional legalities." Margaret felt the words strike too close to their current reality. The woman knew their circumstances, their desperation, with unsettling precision. "How do you know about our situation?" "The house chooses its residents carefully," Eleanor replied. "It calls to those who understand the value of mutual benefit." The Blackwoods were facing bankruptcy in 1987. The mill closure had destroyed their investments, their son's medical bills were overwhelming them. She paused, letting the parallels sink in. They needed sanctuary. The house needed stewardship. The dining room seemed to press closer around them, shadows lengthening despite the crystal's refraction of afternoon light. Margaret could hear the rain intensifying against windows that should have been boarded shut, creating a rhythm that matched her accelerating heartbeat. Stewardship of what? Frank's military bearing had returned, the straight-backed posture he adopted when facing threats he couldn't yet identify. This is a house, not a living thing that makes bargains. Eleanor moved to one of the dining chairs, running her hand along its burgundy velvet upholstery. "Isn't it curious how the electricity works despite being disconnected for 30 years? How fresh food appears each morning? How 12 acres of grounds maintain themselves without landscaping services?" Her smile carried terrible patience. "The house provides, Mr. Chen, but provision requires reciprocity." Margaret's mouth went dry as she processed the implications. They'd stumbled into something that defied rational explanation, yet offered exactly what they needed most: shelter, sustenance, escape from the grinding poverty that threatened to consume their remaining years. The practical part of her mind calculated the value: utilities, food, maintenance on a 12-acre estate, all without cost. The desperate part wondered what price such providence might exact. "What happened to the previous buyers?" she asked. "The ones who didn't stay past sunset?" Eleanor's expression grew distant. They couldn't accept the nature of the arrangement. They wanted conventional ownership, deed, mortgage, neighbors who wave from identical yards. Her pale eyes refocused on Margaret with uncomfortable intensity. They couldn't understand that some sanctuaries require faith rather than paperwork. Frank's hand found Margaret's arm, his touch both protective and warning. She could read his thoughts in the familiar language of married couples. This was dangerous territory, negotiations with terms they didn't understand for stakes they couldn't afford to lose. But Margaret thought of their empty apartment, of bills stacked like accusations on their kitchen table, of Frank rationing medication because dignity was a luxury they couldn't afford. Whatever Eleanor represented, whatever the house demanded, it offered something their conventional world had already denied them: security. "Show us," Margaret said suddenly, the words escaping before her caution could stop them. "Show us what the arrangement entails." Eleanor's smile bloomed with approval that felt both welcoming and predatory. "Excellent. The house appreciates directness." She moved toward the dining room's opposite doorway, her gray dress rustling softly. "But first, you must understand. There are rooms in this house that remember everything. Every conversation, every choice, every moment of weakness or strength." She paused at the threshold. "Once you see what I'm about to show you, your old life becomes inaccessible." Margaret felt Frank's tension beside her, the weight of 41 days until foreclosure balanced against the promise of impossible salvation. Above them, the mysterious rocking had resumed. Not the random creaking of an old house, but the deliberate rhythm of someone keeping vigil. No going back. Margaret whispered, echoing her earlier commitment with new understanding of its implications. Eleanor nodded approvingly. "No going back," she confirmed, then stepped through the doorway into shadows that seemed to welcome her like an embrace. "Follow me, and I'll show you what it means to truly belong somewhere." Margaret's legs felt leaden as she crossed the dining room threshold, Frank's labored breathing behind her, marking each step into unknown territory. The hallway beyond stretched longer than the house's exterior dimensions should have allowed, its burgundy wallpaper adorned with portraits whose eyes seemed to track their movement through the gathering dusk. Eleanor glided ahead with disturbing grace, her gray dress barely rustling against the Persian runner that should have been moth-eaten after 30 years of abandonment. Instead, the fabric beneath Margaret's feet felt plush and newly cleaned, its intricate patterns vivid as fresh blood. "The Blackwood family understood sacrifice," Eleanor said without turning, her voice carrying easily through the corridor's strange acoustics. "Richard Blackwood built this house in 1894, after losing his first fortune in a mining collapse. He knew the value of alternative arrangements. They passed a series of closed doors, each bearing brass nameplate in script too elaborate to read in the dim light. Margaret caught fragments, morning room, conservatory collection, before Eleanor stopped at a heavy oak door marked Simply Family. "Frank," Margaret whispered, reaching back to find his hand. His fingers were ice-cold despite the hallway's oppressive warmth. "We can still leave." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew they weren't true. The front door felt impossibly distant, separated not just by physical space, but by a fundamental shift in reality that had begun the moment they'd accepted Eleanor's existence. Eleanor produced an ornate brass key from her dress pocket, its surface blackened with age. "The Blackwoods kept meticulous records, Mrs. Chen, 43 years of prosperity following their agreement. Their son's medical treatments, fully funded. Richard's business ventures, mysteriously successful. Martha's charitable foundations, endowed beyond her wildest dreams." The key turned with a sound like breaking bones. They wanted for nothing. The door swung open to reveal a parlor frozen in time, or perhaps existing outside time entirely. Gaslight flickered from wall sconces that cast no shadows, illuminating furniture arranged as if waiting for visitors who had been expected for decades. A fire crackled in the hearth despite the November chill being absent from this room, its flames reflecting off porcelain tea service set for 4. But it was the photographs covering every available surface that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. Hundreds of images in silver frames. Family portraits spanning generations, all featuring the same faces that never aged. A stern man with penetrating dark eyes standing beside a woman whose gentle smile never varied across decades of supposed time. Behind them, children who should have grown and aged remained forever young, their positions in the photographs changing, but their appearances locked in terrible consistency. "Richard, Martha, and the twins. James and Catherine," Eleanor said, settling into one of the room's velvet chairs as if she'd done so countless times before. They discovered that some bargains transcend mortality. Frank's grip on Margaret's hand tightened painfully. "Those people should be dead. The photographs span... Christ, they span 60 years. Death," Eleanor mused, "is often simply another form of poverty, isn't it? A failure of resources, of will, of proper arrangements." She gestured toward the mantelpiece where the newest photographs showed the family in 1980s clothing, their faces unmarked by time's passage. "The house provides many forms of security." Margaret forced herself to examine the images more closely, her postal worker's eye for detail cataloging inconsistencies that made her stomach churn. Same faces, same apparent ages, across decades of Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, family gatherings that should have been impossible. Where are they now? Margaret's voice emerged as barely a whisper. Eleanor's smile grew beatific. Everywhere. In the walls that shelter us, in the grounds that sustain us, in the very air we breathe. She stood gracefully, moving to the fire that cast its shadowless light. They became integral to the house's function, essential, eternal. The fire's warmth touched Margaret's face, but couldn't penetrate the chill spreading through her chest. This was madness, supernatural nonsense that violated everything she'd believed about death, aging, the fundamental structure of reality itself. Yet the evidence surrounded her in silver frames and impossibly preserved faces. The previous buyers, Frank said suddenly, his military training providing anchor points of logic in the swirling impossibility. They saw this room. Of course, transparency is essential for informed consent. Eleanor's pale eyes reflected the gaslight like coins. Most people flee at this point. They choose foreclosure, poverty, conventional death over the simple commitment required for true security. Margaret stared at the photographs, at families who had escaped time's tyranny through arrangements that defied comprehension. 41 days until foreclosure, Frank's medical bills mounting like accusations, the grinding poverty that had already begun consuming their dignity. What exactly, Margaret heard herself asking, does the house require? Eleanor's approval felt like warm honey poisoned with ground glass. Simply that you tend to its needs as it tends to yours. That you understand belonging as permanence. Her smile widened. That you trust the house to know what's best for all its residents. Above them, the rocking began again, welcoming now, like a heartbeat. The heartbeat rhythm from above grew louder, and Margaret realized with dawning horror that it wasn't rocking chairs at all. It was the sound of breathing, amplified through the house's walls like a massive lung drawing air. Eleanor's smile widened at Margaret's recognition, her pale eyes gleaming with satisfaction at another successful revelation. "You're beginning to understand," Eleanor said, settling back into her chair with the contentment of someone who had performed this demonstration many times before. "The house is very much alive, Mrs. Chen, and it's been waiting so patiently for you both." Frank's hand slipped from Margaret's as he stumbled backward, his prosthetic catching on the Persian runner. "This is insane. Houses don't breathe. People don't live for 60 years without aging." His voice cracked with the strain of maintaining rational thought in the face of impossible evidence. "Frank." Margaret reached for him, but he was already backing toward the door, his face pale with recognition of a trap they'd walked into willingly. "Frank, wait!" But he was already through the doorway, his uneven gait echoing down the hallway as he fled toward what they both hoped was still an exit. Margaret heard his voice calling from the distance, "Margaret, we're leaving now." But the words seemed to come from very far away, as if the house itself was swallowing sound. "He won't make it to the front door," Eleanor said conversationally, not bothering to look up from the tea service she was now arranging with practiced precision. "The house has accepted you both. It won't simply let you leave with so much knowledge." Margaret's chest constricted with panic that threatened to buckle her knees. "What do you mean?" "I mean, my dear, that your husband is discovering the doors no longer open. The windows have become walls. The very architecture shifts to protect the family's privacy." Eleanor poured tea into delicate china cups, steam rising in spirals that formed impossible patterns in the air. "The house is quite protective of its secrets." Frank's shouts were growing more distant, more frantic. Margaret could hear him rattling door handles, his voice echoing through rooms that seemed to multiply around him like a maze. The sound of his desperation tore at her heart. 43 years of marriage, and she'd led him into this nightmare through her stubborn refusal to accept their circumstances. "Let him go," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I'll stay. I'll make whatever arrangement you want, but let Frank leave." Eleanor's laugh was like wind chimes made of bone. "Oh, my dear, that's not how family works. The house chose you both. Your resourcefulness, his loyalty, the beautiful desperation that brought you here. Splitting a matched set would be wasteful." The photographs around the room seemed to pulse in the gaslight, and Margaret noticed details that made her stomach lurch. In several images, she could see figures in the background, shadowy forms that might have been servants or previous residents or something else entirely. Their faces were indistinct, but their postures suggested subjugation rather than family inclusion. "The others," Margaret whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "The previous buyers who didn't flee, they're still here too." Eleanor nodded approvingly. The house has many needs, Mrs. Chen. The Blackwoods provide oversight and continuity. Others contribute their skills, maintenance, cooking, groundskeeping. Everyone finds their proper place in the hierarchy of service. Her pale eyes fixed on Margaret with uncomfortable intensity. Your postal experience suggests you'd excel at communications, managing correspondence with the outside world, maintaining the illusion of normalcy. Frank's voice had stopped echoing through the distant rooms, replaced by a silence that felt more ominous than his panic. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the magnitude of their situation, trapped in a house that defied physics, negotiating with a woman who spoke of immortality as casually as discussing the weather. What happened to Frank? The words came out sharper than Margaret intended, decades of protective instinct overriding her fear. "He's safe," Eleanor replied, though her definition of safety clearly differed from conventional understanding. The house is simply orienting him to his new circumstances, helping him understand the futility of resistance. She sipped her tea delicately. Men often require more dramatic demonstrations than women. Your gender tends to be more practical about survival. Margaret thought of their apartment, of the foreclosure notice, of the grinding poverty that had driven them to accept a $1 house that had seemed too good to be true. Because it was, because nothing in their lives had ever been simple or generous, and she should have known better than to trust in sudden salvation. But now Frank was somewhere in the house's labyrinthine embrace, and her choices had narrowed to variations of surrender. The photographs watched her with their frozen faces, families who had made similar bargains across decades of desperation. 41 days until foreclosure had become irrelevant. They would never see their old life again. Eleanor refilled her teacup, the sound unnaturally loud in the pressing silence. "Shall we discuss your new accommodations, Mrs. Chen? The house is eager to begin your orientation." Above them, the breathing continued its patient, eternal rhythm. Margaret stared at Eleanor's composed face, at the tea service arranged with predatory precision, at the impossible photographs that documented decades of suspended time. The breathing above them pulsed like a heartbeat, and suddenly every piece of their nightmare clicked into place with devastating clarity. "You're not Eleanor Blackwood," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the gaslight's flickering warmth. "You can't be." Eleanor's teacup paused halfway to her lips, her pale eyes narrowing with what might have been surprise or approval. "Oh?" Eleanor Blackwood would be over 100 years old if she were still alive. "But you're maybe 45. Margaret's postal worker instincts, honed by decades of cataloging details others missed, flooded back despite her terror. "You're wearing a vintage dress, but your teeth are too perfect for someone from the 1890s. Your skin has the smoothness of modern skincare, not the weathering of a century-old woman." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the house's rhythmic breathing and the distant sound of Frank's movements somewhere in the labyrinthine halls. Eleanor set down her teacup with deliberate precision, her composed mask slipping for the first time to reveal something far more disturbing underneath. "Very observant," Eleanor said, her voice taking on a different quality, younger, more contemporary. "I wondered if you'd notice. Most people are too terrified by this point to think clearly." "Who are you?" Margaret demanded. But even as the words left her mouth, a more terrible realization was crystallizing. "How long have you been here?" Eleanor stood gracefully, moving to the mantelpiece where the photographs chronicled impossible longevity. She touched one of the frames, a family portrait from the 1980s, with something that might have been nostalgia or regret. "I was Linda Morrison when I arrived," she said quietly. "My husband Carl and I bought this place in 1983. We were 32 years old, facing bankruptcy after his construction business failed." Her finger traced the glass over faces that never aged. "We thought we were so clever, finding this bargain, so grateful for salvation." Margaret's blood turned to ice as the implications crashed over her. "You've been here for 36 years. "The house is very generous with time, Eleanor," Linda continued, her voice taking on the dreamy quality of someone recounting a half-remembered dream. "It preserves what it values, protects its investments." She turned back to Margaret, and now her face showed its true age, not 45, but the accumulated weight of decades spent in willing captivity. I've been the greeter for so long now, helping newcomers understand their circumstances, easing the transition. The Blackwoods, Margaret whispered. What happened to the real Blackwoods? Linda's smile carried profound sadness. They served their purpose, established the patterns, created the foundations. But the house evolves. It adapts to changing times, changing needs. She gestured toward the photographs. It keeps the memory of them, the essence of their success. But the actual people? They became part of the structure decades ago. Margaret thought of the breathing walls, the impossibly preserved rooms, the sense of being watched by invisible eyes. The house wasn't just alive. It was a collective organism built from the accumulated lives of everyone who had ever made its bargain. The Blackwoods, the Morrisons, countless others who had traded their freedom for security and found themselves becoming building materials for something vast and patient and hungry. Frank, Margaret said suddenly, understanding flooding through her with sick certainty. He's not lost in the maze. You're changing him. The house is helping him understand, Linda corrected gently. Men often resist longer, require more dramatic persuasion. But he'll adapt. They always do. Her pale eyes held decades of practiced sympathy. It's easier if you don't fight it, Margaret. The house rewards cooperation. But Margaret was already moving, her 70-year-old body surprising her with sudden strength as she pushed past Linda toward the door. Behind her, she heard gentle laughter like wind through dead leaves. Where are you going, dear? The doors won't open for you now. Margaret didn't respond, her mind racing as she stumbled into the hallway. The photographs along the walls showed different faces now. She caught glimpses of families from the 1920s, the 1950s, the 1980s, all frozen in eternal contentment while something vast and invisible fed on their lives like a slow-burning candle. Frank was somewhere in this nightmare, undergoing whatever transformation the house required of its male residents. And she, Margaret Chen, retired postal worker, survivor of 43 years of marriage and 67 years of life, was supposed to smile and accept her role as the new greeter, the next Linda Morrison, helping future desperate couples understand their beautiful trap. Above her, the breathing intensified, and Margaret realized the house was excited. It thought it had won. Margaret's hands clenched into fists as something shifted inside her, not surrender, but the cold fury of someone who had spent a lifetime surviving systems designed to crush people like her. The house might be patient and vast and hungry, but it had never met Margaret Chen. Margaret pressed her back against the hallway wall, feeling the pulse of life beneath the wallpaper like a second heartbeat. The house's excitement thrummed around her, anticipation of another successful harvest, another family absorbed into its endless hunger. But that excitement also revealed something crucial. The house's confidence had made it careless. For the first time since entering the impossible parlor, Margaret allowed herself to truly think, not react, not panic, but think with the methodical precision that had made her an exceptional postal worker for 43 years. She'd spent decades navigating bureaucratic labyrinths, solving problems that seemed impossible, finding solutions buried in fine print and overlooked details. This was just another system, and every system had weaknesses. The photographs lining the hallway flickered between decades, showing different families trapped in the same eternal tableau. But Margaret noticed something Linda Morrison hadn't mentioned: gaps in the timeline. The 1930s were barely represented. The 1970s showed only fragments. Several periods were missing entirely, suggesting that not every attempt at harvesting had succeeded. The house has failed before. The breathing above her shifted, becoming more agitated, as if it sensed the dangerous direction of her thoughts. Margaret forced herself to remain still, projecting the defeated compliance the house expected while her mind catalogued every detail from their arrival. The electricity that functioned without connection to the grid, the fresh food appearing each morning, the doors that had opened easily for desperate buyers but now refused to let them leave. The house needed to maintain its illusion of generosity until its victims were fully committed, which meant it operated under rules. Supernatural rules, perhaps, but rules nonetheless. Every trap has an opening mechanism. "Frank?" she called softly, her voice carrying down the impossible corridors. "Frank, can you hear me?" His response came faintly, distorted by distance and the house's acoustic manipulation. "Margaret? Margaret, the doors, they're not doors anymore, they're just walls." But something in his voice wasn't defeat. It was anger. The particular rage of a man who'd survived combat only to be ambushed in what should have been safety. Frank Chen had spent 30 years in the army dealing with enemies who used deception and misdirection. He would be analyzing their situation with military precision, looking for tactical advantages. "I'm not alone." Margaret moved carefully down the hallway, testing each floorboard before putting her full weight down. The house's breathing created a rhythm she could use to mask her movements. Inhale to step, exhale to pause. Decades of delivering mail had taught her to move efficiently through hostile territory, whether it was aggressive dogs or suspicious homeowners. She found Frank in what had once been the mansion's library, methodically examining the windows that now showed solid wall instead of glass. His prosthetic leg was propped against a chair while he worked, his face set in the concentrated expression she'd learned to recognize during his worst pain episodes. But this wasn't physical pain driving him. It was the focused determination of a soldier who refused to surrender. "The transformation isn't immediate," he said without looking up, his voice pitched low to avoid the house's attention. "Whatever process they use, it takes time. We're still ourselves." Margaret felt a surge of fierce love for this man who could find tactical advantages in supernatural captivity. She moved to his side, keeping her voice equally quiet. "I talked to the woman. Her real name is Linda Morrison. She's been here since 1983. Frank's hand stilled on the window frame. 36 years. Christ. He turned to meet her eyes. She was our age when she arrived. The house preserves what it needs, keeps its assets functional. Margaret's postal experience with institutional manipulation provided unexpected clarity. But it's not perfect. I saw gaps in the photographs, decades where it failed to harvest anyone. Meaning? Meaning some people escaped, or disrupted the process enough to break the pattern. Margaret touched the wall where a window should be, feeling the strange solidity that had replaced glass and wood. The house is confident because it usually wins, but usually isn't always. Frank pulled himself upright, his military bearing reasserting itself despite their impossible circumstances. "The electrical system. You noticed it works without external power. Everything works without external connection. Heat, lights, even running water." Margaret felt pieces clicking together in her mind. The house is self-contained, a closed system. And every closed system has a power source. Frank's eyes brightened with the first hope she'd seen since the parlor revelation. Something that maintains the illusion, powers the transformations, keeps the whole supernatural machine running. Margaret thought of the breathing walls, the rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from somewhere above them. The attic, that's where the breathing is strongest. The heart of the system. Frank was already moving toward the door, his prosthetic clicking against the hardwood floor. "If we can find it, disrupt it." The house might have to choose between maintaining its prisoners or preserving itself. Margaret felt her postal worker instincts align with Frank's military training. "It's worth a try." Above them, the breathing suddenly shifted, faster now, more agitated. The house had realized its newest acquisitions weren't surrendering quietly. The house's agitation manifested immediately. The hallway stretched longer as they approached it, doorways multiplying and shifting like a kaleidoscope of architectural impossibility. Margaret felt the floorboards beneath her feet soften and pulse, trying to slow their progress through sheer physical manipulation. "It's fighting us," Frank muttered, his prosthetic clicking against wood that kept changing texture from solid oak to something more organic. "Good. Means we're onto something." Margaret gripped his arm as the ceiling lowered incrementally, forcing them to duck. The photographs along the walls were cycling rapidly now, Decades of trapped families flashing past in desperate succession, their frozen smiles taking on the quality of warnings rather than welcomes. She caught glimpses of Linda Morrison at different stages of her captivity, growing more ethereal with each passing decade until she became the Eleanor Blackwood performance Margaret had witnessed. "The stairs," Frank said, pointing ahead where a narrow staircase had materialized. "It's trying to hide them, but look." Margaret saw what he meant. The house's panic had created inconsistencies in its illusions. While the main staircase kept shifting position and style, sometimes Victorian mahogany, sometimes modern industrial metal, the servants' stairs remained constant. A narrow utilitarian passage that the house's consciousness seemed to overlook in its focus on grand deceptions. They climbed in silence, Frank's breathing labored but determined. Margaret counted steps automatically. Postal worker habits died hard, noting how the house tried to add extra flights, create false landings, anything to delay their ascent. But desperation had sharpened their perception. Each illusion lasted only moments before reality reasserted itself through sheer, stubborn observation. The second floor revealed the house's true desperation. Rooms opened onto rooms in impossible configurations, bathrooms that led to kitchens that opened back onto the same hallway they'd just left. Margaret heard voices calling from behind doors that vanished when approached directly. Frank's military training kicked in, and he began marking their path with small objects from his pockets. A button here, a coin there, breadcrumbs to navigate the supernatural maze. "Margaret? Frank?" Linda Morrison's voice drifted from somewhere nearby, but the acoustics made it impossible to pinpoint direction. "Please don't make this more difficult than necessary. The house becomes unpleasant when resisted." As if summoned by her words, the temperature began dropping. Not the gentle autumn chill they'd experienced before, but a bone-deep cold that suggested winter in a place where seasons had no meaning. Margaret's breath misted as they reached what should have been the third floor, finding instead a corridor lined with doors that breathed in rhythm with the house's pulse. "The attic access," Frank said, pointing to a pull-down ladder that kept trying to retract into the ceiling. "There!" Margaret lunged for the cord, her 70-year-old joints protesting as she hauled down the ladder against the house's resistance. The metal rungs were ice-cold, burning her palms, but she held on with the grip strength developed through decades of handling mail in all weather conditions. Above them, the breathing was no longer rhythmic but ragged, panicked. The house knew exactly what they intended, and its fear was palpable. Frank went first despite his prosthetic, his upper body strength compensating for the awkward angle. Margaret followed, feeling the ladder try to collapse beneath her weight, not from structural failure, but from the house's active sabotage. The cold was brutal now, turning their breath to visible clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics allowed. The attic space they emerged into defied the mansion's external architecture. Instead of the cramped, sloped ceiling Margaret expected, they found themselves in a vast chamber that stretched beyond the reach of vision. The breathing sound was deafening here, not coming from the walls but from something at the chamber's center. Margaret's postal worker instincts, trained to identify and categorize even under pressure, struggled to process what she saw. It wasn't quite organic and wasn't quite mechanical, a pulsing mass of interwoven materials that might have been wood and bone and metal and flesh, all fused into something that generated its own light. Threads of energy extended from it in all directions, disappearing into the chamber's walls like a vast nervous system. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. "It's not a house at all." Margaret understood. The Victorian mansion, the rooms, even the elaborate backstory of the Blackwood family, all of it was camouflage. Beneath the illusion, they were inside something alive, something that had learned to mimic human architecture to lure in the sustenance it needed. The central mass pulsed faster as they approached, and Margaret felt its attention focus on them with the weight of desperate hunger. Around the chamber's perimeter, she could see other shapes, motionless figures that might once have been human now serving as living components in the creature's vast biological machinery. Frank was already moving, his military training taking over. "If we can disrupt the power source," the house screamed. Not through sound, but through every nerve ending, every bone, every cell in their bodies. The final confrontation had begun. The scream hit them like a physical force, driving Margaret to her knees on the chamber's impossible floor. But 43 years of dealing with hostile dogs, aggressive homeowners, and bureaucratic stonewalling had taught her something the house hadn't anticipated: how to function through pain that demanded surrender. She forced herself upright, her postal worker's instincts cataloging everything even as the psychic assault continued. The central mass, the creature's true heart, was larger up close, easily 20 feet across, and pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly. But it was the human figures around the chamber's perimeter that made her stomach lurch. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, standing in alcoves carved into the living walls. Their eyes were closed, their faces peaceful, but threads of the same energy that emanated from the central mass connected to their heads, their hearts, their spines. Living batteries, she realized. The house didn't just trap people, it kept them alive indefinitely, feeding off their life force in measured doses. "Frank," she gasped, pointing to a cluster of figures that still wore 1980s clothing. The Blackwoods, the real Blackwoods. He followed her gaze, his face grim as military training helped him compartmentalize the horror. And the Morrisons. Everyone who ever made the bargain. His eyes found Margaret's. Everyone except the ones who found this place. The house's scream was evolving, becoming more targeted, more personal. Margaret felt it trying to burrow into her memories, seeking the desperation that had brought them here. Images flooded her mind: foreclosure notices, medical bills, the terrifying arithmetic of poverty and old age. The creature was attempting to remind her why surrender was logical, why resistance meant returning to a world that had already abandoned them. But Margaret Chen had spent decades delivering mail to houses where people fought impossible odds. Single mothers working 3 jobs, elderly couples choosing between medication and food. Veterans like Frank, discarded by the system they'd served. She knew something the house didn't. Desperation could be fuel instead of weakness. "It needs willing victims," she said, the realization cutting through the psychic noise. "Look at them. They're not suffering. They're peaceful, content." Frank understood immediately. "It can't just take. We have to choose to stay." The chamber shuddered around them, and Margaret felt the house's frustration like static electricity against her skin. It had expected them to be overwhelmed by the revelation, to accept their fate with the resignation of people who'd already lost everything. Instead, they were analyzing it like a problem to be solved. Margaret moved closer to the central mass, fighting the creature's attempts to turn her away. The energy threads pulsing from its core weren't random. They followed patterns, carrying information back and forth between the heart and its human components. A vast neural network with the captured people serving as processing nodes. "It's not just feeding," she said. "It's thinking with them, using their minds as part of its consciousness." "A collective intelligence," Frank agreed, his voice tight with concentration. "But that means—" "It means interrupting the network might disrupt everything." Margaret's postal experience with complex systems suddenly felt relevant in ways she'd never imagined. "If we can disconnect enough of the nodes simultaneously." The house's response was immediate and violent. The chamber floor rippled like water, trying to separate them from each other and from the central mass. Gravity shifted unpredictably. Up became down, walls became floors, and Margaret found herself clinging to Frank's arm as the only constant in a space that had abandoned physical laws entirely. But the creature's panic also revealed something crucial. It was afraid, genuinely afraid in a way that suggested they were closer to success than failure. Margaret thought of Linda Morrison, trapped in her greeter role for 36 years, her real identity slowly dissolving into the house's mythology. Of the Blackwood family, reduced to photographs and backstory, while their actual bodies served as components in an alien machine. Of every desperate person who'd thought they'd found salvation only to become fuel for something vast and patient and hungry. The fury that rose in her then wasn't the hot anger of sudden betrayal, but the cold rage of someone who'd spent a lifetime watching systems designed to crush the vulnerable. The house was just another predator wearing the mask of salvation, another institution that thrived by exploiting the desperation of people who'd run out of choices. Together, she told Frank, reaching toward the nearest cluster of energy threads. On 3. He nodded, positioning himself near another section of the network, his military training overriding the house's attempts to confuse his movements. 1, Margaret said, feeling the creature's attention focus on them with the intensity of a laser. 2, Frank replied, his prosthetic braced against the shifting floor. The house gathered itself for one final assault, preparing to throw everything into preventing what it sensed coming. 3. They reached for the threads of light that connected the creature to its victims, ready to discover whether two broken old people could shatter a nightmare that had fed on human desperation for longer than they'd been alive. Margaret's fingers closed around the energy threads, and the universe exploded into sensation. Every thought, every memory, every moment of consciousness from hundreds of trapped minds flooded through her at once. She was simultaneously a young mother in 1952 desperate to feed her children, a widower in 1978 facing cancer bills alone, a disabled veteran in 1995 choosing between dignity and survival. The creature had collected them all. Decades of human desperation distilled into pure, concentrated fear. But Margaret Chen has spent 43 years walking through other people's lives, delivering their bills and benefits, their rejections and acceptances. She knew how to navigate emotional storms without drowning in them. Instead of being overwhelmed by the psychic flood, she began sorting through it with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd processed thousands of addresses under deadline pressure. Find the pattern. Find the weakness. Frank's military training served him differently but equally well. Where Margaret absorbed and analyzed, he attacked with surgical precision. His prosthetic leg, the house's symbol of his vulnerability, became an anchor point as he systematically severed energy threads with the ruthless efficiency of someone dismantling an enemy weapons system. The creature's scream shifted into something beyond sound, a vibration that made reality itself shake. The chamber walls began dissolving, revealing glimpses of the mansion's true nature underneath. Not Victorian architecture at all, but something organic and ancient that had learned to mimic human construction the way a spider mimics a flower. Margaret. Frank's voice cut through the psychic chaos. The central mass, it's weakening. She could see it too. The bioluminescent patterns were flickering, the rhythmic pulsing becoming erratic. But more importantly, the human figures around the chamber's perimeter were beginning to stir. Eyelids fluttered. Fingers twitched. The network disruption was breaking the creature's hold on its victims. The house fought back with everything it had. Gravity reversed completely, sending them tumbling toward what had been the ceiling. The temperature plunged to Arctic levels, then spiked to desert heat within seconds. The air itself became hostile, thick as mud one moment, thin as mountain atmosphere the next. But desperation had taught Margaret and Frank something the creature couldn't comprehend, how to function when everything was working against you. They'd spent years navigating systems designed to exhaust and defeat them. This was just another hostile bureaucracy, albeit one with supernatural enforcement mechanisms. Margaret grabbed another cluster of energy threads, feeling the creature's attention splinter as it tried to maintain control over too many fronts simultaneously. The postal worker's instinct that had served her through budget cuts, route changes, and technological upheavals kicked in. When the system fails, you become the system. "Linda," she called out, spotting the woman's figure among the chamber's prisoners. "Linda Morrison, remember who you are." The response was immediate. Linda's eyes snapped open, confusion and recognition warring across her features. For 36 years, she'd been Eleanor Blackwood, perfect hostess in a perfect Victorian parlor. But underneath that manufactured identity, Linda Morrison, pragmatic, stubborn, determined Linda Morrison, had never quite surrendered. Linda's voice was rusty with disuse but growing stronger. "I remember. God help me, I remember everything." Her awakening created a cascade effect. Other figures began stirring, decades of stolen consciousness fighting back toward awareness. The Blackwood family themselves, the real Blackwoods, opened their eyes in their alcoves, looking around with the bewildered, recognition of people waking from the longest sleep in human history. The creature's panic became palpable. Its central mass writhed with increasing violence, energy threads lashing like whips as it tried to re-establish control, but the network was collapsing faster than it could repair itself. Each awakened prisoner weakened its hold on the others. Frank had worked his way to the creature's core, his hands wrapped around what might have been its primary neural conduit. The energy flowing through the organic cable was visible now, a river of stolen life force that had sustained the house's illusions for decades. "This is for everyone who never had a choice," he said, and pulled. The effect was catastrophic. Every light in the chamber went out simultaneously. The breathing that had been the house's constant soundtrack stopped mid-inhale. For a moment that stretched toward eternity, Margaret felt herself suspended in absolute darkness and silence. Then reality reasserted itself with violent force. The chamber collapsed around them, not falling, but dissolving like sugar in rain. Margaret felt herself tumbling through impossible spaces, past rooms that had never existed, downstairs that led nowhere, through doors that opened onto memories instead of places. She hit solid ground hard, Frank's arms around her, both of them rolling across what felt like actual grass under actual starlight. The Blackwood Estate, the real mansion, not the creature's elaborate mimicry, stood before them in the November darkness, genuinely abandoned now, its windows dark and its Victorian lines stark against the night sky. Behind them, something that had fed on human desperation for more than a century died quietly in the Pennsylvania woods, taking its appetite with it into whatever darkness waits beyond even the longest hungers. Margaret lay gasping on the frost-brittle grass, Frank's familiar warmth the only anchor in a world that had just reshuffled itself around them. Above, real stars, cold, distant, indifferent stars, pierced a November sky that owed nothing to any creature's hunger. The silence was profound, empty of the breathing that had become their constant companion. "Is it over?" Frank whispered, his voice hoarse from the psychic screaming. Before Margaret could answer, shapes began materializing around them in the starlight. The Blackwood family stumbled from the mansion's shadow, not the perfect Victorian archetypes they become in the creature's mythology, but ordinary people blinking away decades of stolen dreams. A middle-aged man in a faded business suit, a woman with graying hair and laugh lines worn deep by a life cut short in 1987. Two teenagers who should have been grandparents by now, their faces untouched by the years they'd lost. Linda Morrison emerged last, her 1980s clothing incongruous but real, her careful hostess composure finally shattered. She moved like someone relearning how to inhabit her own body, each step a conscious decision. 36 years, Linda said, her voice carrying a weight that made Margaret's chest ache. "I felt every day pass, aware but unable to choose anything." Other figures appeared, dozens of them spanning decades. The young mother from 1952, her desperation to feed her children still etched in her face, despite the impossible preservation. The widower with his cancer bills. Veterans from 3 different wars, all carrying the same haunted recognition in Frank's prosthetic. Margaret struggled to her feet, Frank's steady presence keeping her upright as her 70-year-old joints protested. The group of freed prisoners watched them with expressions that mixed gratitude with something more complicated, the hollow awareness of people who discovered the true cost of their salvation. "What happens now?" asked one of the Blackwood teenagers, her voice carrying a tremor that had nothing to do with cold. "Our families, our lives, everything we knew is gone." The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. Victory, she realized, hadn't returned these people to their lives. It had stranded them in a world that had moved on without them. Spouses had remarried or died. Children had grown up and grown old. Entire universes of connection had dissolved in their absence. "The house gave us everything," Linda said quietly, understanding dawning in her voice. "Food, shelter, purpose. Even if it was artificial, even if it was wrong, we had a place." Margaret felt the weight of what they'd done settling over her like lead. They'd freed these people from supernatural captivity, yes, but into what? A November night in 2019, with no identification, No records, no proof they'd ever existed. The creature had erased them so thoroughly that their freedom was indistinguishable from homelessness. "We'll figure it out," Frank said, his military certainty reassuring despite its obvious uncertainty. "People survive. That's what people do." But Margaret knew better. She delivered enough eviction notices, enough benefit denials, enough official documentation of systematic abandonment to understand the machinery these people would face. The creature had fed on human desperation, but that desperation existed because the ordinary world had its own appetite for consuming the vulnerable. "The money," she said suddenly, remembering. "Our savings, the deed to this place." She laughed, a sound brittle with exhaustion. "We put everything into buying this house. Everything we had." Frank's face went carefully neutral, but she caught the flicker of understanding. Their desperate gamble to escape poverty hadn't just failed, it had consumed the last resources that might have cushioned the failure. They'd traded their meager financial security for a battle that had saved dozens of lives but left everyone, including themselves, with nothing. The Blackwood patriarch, Robert, Margaret remembered from the creature's elaborate fiction, approached with the careful dignity of a man trying to process an impossible situation. "You gave up your own survival to free us. Why?" Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding them, people displaced in time, cut loose from everything that had defined them, facing a world that would struggle to accept their existence. Some were crying quietly. Others stared at the genuine mansion with the hollow recognition of people seeing their prison finally revealed as exactly that. "Because nobody should have to choose," she said finally. "Nobody should have to pick between dignity and survival, between holding onto yourself and having a place to exist. The choice itself is the trap." Frank's hand found hers, his calloused fingers intertwining with her own. "So what do we do?" Margaret Chen, retired postal worker, looked at her husband and the dozens of displaced people surrounding them in the November darkness. She thought of the creature's final lesson, that even victory could be another kind of trap, that sometimes the cost of winning was discovering there was no prize waiting. "We figure out how to survive together," she said. "All of us. Whatever that looks like." The real Blackwood Estate stood behind them, genuinely empty now, offering nothing but honest shelter in a world that had forgotten how to provide even that without extracting a price that devoured souls. The next hour passed in fragments, practical decisions made by people too exhausted for the weight they carried. Linda Morrison, drawing on organizational skills that had survived 36 years of supernatural servitude, divided the group into manageable units. The Blackwood family huddled together near the mansion's front steps, their reunion muted by the understanding that they were strangers to each other now, preserved but not unchanged. The older displaced prisoners, those taken in the 1950s and 60s, sat in quiet clusters, their faces carrying the particular devastation of people who'd outlived their own eras. Margaret watched Frank help the disabled veterans find stable ground, his prosthetic no longer a symbol of vulnerability, but simply a fact navigated with practiced efficiency. The creature's elaborate manipulation felt distant now, like a fever dream dissolving in daylight. What remained was starker: 43 people with no legal existence, no resources, no place in a world that had already forgotten them. "The house still has running water," Robert Blackwood reported after a tentative exploration. "Electricity, too, somehow. Basic utilities." "City services never stopped," Margaret realized. "When we bought the property, everything was included in the transfer. They thought they were selling us an empty mansion." The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. The municipal utility departments had maintained services to feed a supernatural parasite for decades, and now those same services would sustain the people it had consumed. Government efficiency serving horror, then accidentally enabling salvation. Linda approached with the careful steps of someone still learning to trust solid ground. "We need documentation," she said, her hostess training redirected toward logistics. "Social security numbers, identification, proof we existed before." She gestured vaguely at the mansion. "Medical records, birth certificates, anything that establishes our legal presence." "Most of that burned when the house created its illusions," said Janet Blackwood, Robert's wife. Her voice carried the flat affect of someone processing impossible loss. Our real lives were edited, selectively preserved. Margaret felt the familiar weight of bureaucratic impossibility settling over them. How do you prove existence to a system that requires documentation to acknowledge existence? How do you rebuild lives when the infrastructure for rebuilding assumes you never left? One step at a time, Frank said, reading her expression. We establish residence here first. Get utility bills in our names. That creates a paper trail. Then we work backward through the system. Assuming we can stay, added Thomas Blackwood, the younger son whose teenage face seemed grotesque with the wisdom of someone who'd experienced decades while remaining 17. The property deed is yours, legally. 43 people suddenly appearing would be impossible to explain, Margaret finished, even if anyone believed us. The weight of their situation crystallized into sharp focus. They'd broken the creature's control, but breaking free and building sustainable lives were entirely different challenges. The ordinary world had its own mechanisms for consuming the vulnerable. Slower than supernatural predation, perhaps, but no less thorough. We don't all have to stay, said Eleanor Chen, a woman taken in 1974 whose name Margaret found uncomfortably familiar. Some of us might have families still living, people who remember us. Linda shook her head. I checked. During the early years when I still had moments of clarity, my sister assumed I'd died, had memorial services, moved on. Her voice carried no bitterness, just the exhausted acceptance of someone who'd already grieved her own life. Appearing now would be cruel to her, another kind of haunting. The truth settled over them like November frost. They weren't just displaced, they were ghosts made flesh, carrying the weight of mourned absences. Their families had survived their disappearances by accepting them as final. Resurrection would be trauma masquerading as miracle. So we become a family, Margaret said quietly. All of us. The ones who can reconnect with their old lives they try. The ones who can't, we build something new. Frank's hand tightened around hers. 43 people sharing a property we can't afford to maintain. 45, she corrected. We're all in this together. Robert Blackwood studied the mansion's dark windows with the expression of someone seeing home and prison simultaneously. It's large enough. 12 bedrooms, multiple common areas. We could establish individual spaces while sharing resources. A commune, said Linda, her hostess instincts already calculating logistics. Shared meals, divided responsibilities, pooled income from whatever work we can find. Margaret thought of the creature's final lesson about survival requiring sacrifice. But this was different, not predation disguised as salvation, but conscious cooperation born from shared necessity, the choice to depend on each other instead of having dependence imposed by a supernatural parasite. We'll need rules, Frank said, agreements about privacy, responsibilities, decision-making. And we'll need to be careful about outside attention, added Thomas. 43 people appearing simultaneously will draw questions we can't answer honestly. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding them, people bound together by shared trauma and common desperation, but also by the rare knowledge of what genuine freedom cost. Then we learn how to be a family, she said, however long it takes. The Blackwood Estate stood behind them, no longer haunted but heavy with possibility, shelter that demanded nothing more supernatural than the ordinary miracle of people choosing to survive together. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the kitchen of what the group had started calling simply the house, watching Linda coordinate breakfast for 45 people with the efficiency of someone managing a small hotel. The morning routine had evolved into something Margaret barely recognized from her old life, a careful ballet of shared responsibilities that somehow fed everyone on a budget that would have left 2 people hungry. Mrs. Chen? Sarah Blackwood, not the teenager from 1987, but a woman displaced in 1963, approached with the tentative politeness they all still use with each other. The county assessor called. They want to schedule a property inspection. Margaret's stomach tightened, but not with the paralyzing terror that such calls had once triggered. 3 months of collective problem-solving had taught her that every crisis was manageable when 45 people pooled their experience to address it. We'll handle it, she said, meaning it. Linda's been documenting everything for the insurance claims. Frank and Robert have the structural improvements mapped out. We're legal residents now, all of us. That last part had been the hardest victory. Establishing legal existence for people who'd been missing for decades had required creativity that bordered on fraud, carefully constructed paper trails that satisfied bureaucratic requirements without triggering deeper investigations. Margaret's decades of postal service had proved invaluable. She understood the gaps in government systems, the places where careful documentation could create retroactive legitimacy. Frank entered through the back door, his prosthetic no longer hidden under careful clothing choices. Thomas Blackwood followed, both men carrying the satisfied exhaustion of people who'd spent the morning repairing the greenhouse that now provided 30% of their food. Frank moved differently these days. Not the careful navigation of someone managing disability, but the confident stride of someone whose limitations were simply factors in larger calculations. "How's the job search going?" Margaret asked, kissing his cheek as he passed. "Promising," Frank said, settling into one of the mismatched chairs they'd accumulated. "The Veterans Organization downtown needs an advocate, someone who understands navigating systems." He smiled with an irony that had taken months to develop. Turns out fighting supernatural predators translates well to fighting bureaucratic ones. Margaret felt pride bloom in her chest, followed immediately by the strange disorientation that still caught her sometimes. This was Frank, her husband of 43 years, but also a man she was still learning to know. The creature's manipulation had stripped away layers of careful protection they'd both worn, leaving them more honest with each other than they'd been since their early marriage. "The university called back," she said, pulling an envelope from the stack of mail that arrived daily now. Bills, opportunities, official correspondence that proved their existence to the world. "They want to interview me for the academic support coordinator position." Frank's face lit up. "Margaret, that's wonderful. You'd be perfect for that." She would be, she realized. The woman who'd spent years helping people navigate the postal system's bureaucracy, who'd learned to manage 45 displaced souls into a functioning household, who'd developed the particular patience required to help people understand complex systems while maintaining their dignity. "It feels strange," she admitted. "Having choices again. Real ones." Linda approached with coffee for both of them, her movements carrying the relaxed confidence of someone who'd found purpose without coercion. "The afternoon meeting is about the Hendersons," she said quietly. "They've decided to try reconnecting with their daughter." Margaret nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. Every few weeks, someone from their group attempted to rebuild bridges to their former lives. Sometimes it worked, joyful reunions that required careful explanation but led to genuine reconciliation. More often, it revealed the irreparable damage that decades of absence had created. The Hendersons, taken in 1979, had discovered their only child was now 57, had spent 40 years believing them dead, and was struggling to process their return. "We'll support whatever they decide," Margaret said, the automatic response they'd all learned. Support without judgment, assistance without pressure, the opposite of everything the creature had offered. Robert Blackwood appeared in the doorway, holding a letter with the particular tension that accompanied certain kinds of official mail. "The state wants to do a feature story," he said, "about innovative housing solutions for seniors. They've heard about our intentional community." The euphemism made Margaret smile despite her nervousness. Their story, carefully edited to remove supernatural elements, had become a model for addressing elder poverty and social isolation. The state saw cooperative living, local churches saw mutual support, social workers saw creative resource sharing. Everyone saw what they needed to see, and no one asked uncomfortable questions about how 45 strangers had found each other. "We'll do the interview," Margaret decided. "It might help other people realize they have options." Frank's hand found hers across the table, his fingers intertwining with the natural ease of people who no longer questioned their right to comfort each other. Around them, the house hummed with the ordinary chaos of people choosing to build something together, not perfect, not easy, but honest in ways that salvation rarely was. Outside, February snow covered the 12 acres they now called home, and inside, 45 people who'd learned the difference between surviving and living continued the patient work of creating both. 6 months after the state feature story aired, Margaret Chen stood in what had once been the Blackwood Estate's formal dining room, watching her granddaughter Emma help Linda set up chairs for the monthly house meeting. The sight still caught her off guard. 4 generations of her family gathered in a place that had once fed on desperation, now simply feeding people. Emma had driven down from Pittsburgh with her 2 young children, a monthly tradition that began when Margaret finally found the courage to call her son David and attempt to explain where she and Frank had disappeared to. The conversation had been careful, complicated, full of strategic omissions about supernatural predators and careful emphasis on intentional community and creative housing solutions. David had been skeptical, then worried, then gradually amazed as he witnessed his parents' transformation from frightened, isolated seniors into confident organizers of what local media had dubbed Pennsylvania's most successful elder cooperative. "Grandma, why do you have so many meetings?" 6-year-old Katie asked, arranging colored pencils on the children's table they'd added to accommodate the growing number of visitors. "Because democracy is messy," Margaret replied, repeating something Frank had started saying. "When 45 people live together, we have to talk through everything." It was true. Their success had bred complexity, media attention leading to inquiries from other seniors seeking similar arrangements, state funding opportunities that required careful documentation, zoning questions that needed community consensus. The house that had once operated through supernatural manipulation now hummed with the ordinary chaos of people negotiating shared life through committee structure and consensus building. Frank emerged from the kitchen, carrying the coffee urn they'd purchased after the 15th journalist arrived to document their innovative approach to aging in place. His walk held the confident rhythm of someone who'd found his purpose. 3 days a week at the Veterans Organization, 2 days managing the house's external relationships, weekends devoted to the greenhouse that now supplied produce to 4 local restaurants. "Channel 8 wants to do a follow-up story," he reported. 6 months later, "How's it working?" "Better than anyone expected," Margaret said, and meant it. The group had stabilized at 47 people. 2 new additions who'd arrived through word of mouth, both seniors facing impossible housing costs who'd heard about their model and asked to join. The integration process they developed was careful, thorough, designed to ensure compatibility while maintaining the trust that held everything together. Linda called the meeting to order with the practiced authority of someone who'd transformed supernatural servitude into elected leadership. The agenda was routine: budget review, maintenance schedules, the ongoing discussion about expanding their model to help establish similar communities elsewhere. Margaret only half listened to the familiar rhythms of democratic process. Instead, she watched faces that had become beloved family. Robert Blackwood describing his part-time teaching position at the community college, Sarah coordinating the childcare cooperative that allowed house members to work outside jobs, Thomas presenting research on sustainable energy systems that could make them fully self-sufficient. These were people who'd learned to survive through genuine cooperation rather than desperate submission. The difference felt profound even in small moments, the way disagreements were negotiated through discussion rather than supernatural compulsion, how resources were shared through conscious choice rather than artificial abundance. "The university wants Margaret to present at their conference on rural innovation," Frank announced during New Business, his pride evident. "Sustainable communities and economic resilience." Margaret felt the familiar flutter of nervous excitement that had replaced the constant anxiety of her former life. At 68, she was building a career from the patient skills she'd developed helping displaced people navigate bureaucratic systems. The woman who'd once felt abandoned by every institution she'd trusted was now consulting with those same institutions on how to serve vulnerable populations more effectively. After the meeting, as House members dispersed to evening routines that had become comfortably predictable, Margaret walked the halls that had once terrorized her. The mansion felt entirely ordinary now, large, requiring constant maintenance, full of the cheerful noise that accompanied any space where nearly 50 people shared daily life. She found Frank in their room, reading one of the history books he'd started collecting again, surrounded by the personal belongings they'd gradually accumulated. Real possessions chosen freely, not supernatural provisions designed to ensure dependence. "No regrets?" he asked, looking up as she settled beside him. Margaret considered the question seriously. Their financial security remained fragile, dependent on the careful balance of pooled resources and shared responsibilities. Their privacy was limited, their future uncertain in ways that traditional retirement planning never anticipated. But fear no longer governed their choices. They were building something sustainable through honest cooperation, not perfect, not easy, but real in ways that salvation rarely was. "None," she said, meaning it completely. Outside their window, the 12 acres they now called home stretched under evening sky, and inside, 47 people who'd learned the difference between surviving and living continued the patient work of creating both.